Dr. Musil is Senior Scholar and Director of Civic Learning and Democracy Initiatives at the Association of American Colleges and Universities in Washington, D.C. Many of you know her. She had served as the Senior VP for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Global Initiatives at AAC&U for over 14 years before this current role. She has been writing and speaking and directing national projects, and I know she flies internationally as well many a times to continue to advocate for civic engagement, diversity, and democracy over the last 2 decades. As David said, she is the author of The Crucible Moment, which became a national report that represents the collective wisdom of a broad constituency of higher ed, and it was a big deal enough to be released at a White House event. And I recall in 2012 as well is when AAC&U released the High Impact Educational Practices document, which also caught fire, and we in Tennessee have embraced since. Last year, she directed a joint project with the Kettering Foundation that led to a special peer review issue titled Rethinking Preparation for Work, a Civic-Enriched Liberal Education. It was released in summer 2005, which argues that helping undergraduates develop a civic lens to determine one's responsibility to the common good is a critical dimension of being ready for the workplace. Her most recent publication, which I walk around with and sleep around with, is called Civic Prompts, Making Civic Learning Routine Across the Disciplines. It's an excellent piece, and I think everyone should keep a reference copy. It offers ways for departments to integrate civic inquiries, issues, pedagogies, and assignments as a means of teaching their subject matter more effectively. Currently, she is directing a National Endowment for the Humanities project titled Citizenship Under Siege with 7 community colleges and in partnership with the democracy commitment that David mentioned. Before assuming national level positions, Dr. Musil was a faculty member for 16 years in English and in women's studies. So I'm sure you all can relate to her, and she can relate to you all as an educator who I know for sure have an obligation to love all and serve all, and much is asked of you and much is expected of you. And I hope you all will take this opportunity to connect with Caryn over time and invite her to your campuses to continue this work. She has a BA from Duke and her MA and PhD in English from Northwestern. Caryn was just here for us in February at Pulaski State in Knoxville for a Tennessee Campus Compact professional development event. And I'm so grateful that she was willing to come back a second time, the same year back to Tennessee. I also want to register with us present here today. Regrettably, in February of 2016, Tennessee somehow got itself ranked number 4th in the country for hate groups. We have 41 registered hate groups in the state, and apparently 10 of them are lurking right here in Middle Tennessee. So as Caryn shares her thoughts on democracy and diversity, I would like for us all to be thinking, obviously I think we are grown up enough to know there will always be folks who will gravitate to that type of mindset, but how do we as educators figure out to somehow make efforts to counterbalance and make sure there are as many love groups as possible as there are hate groups. And I think our campuses have an obligation there. So I think I just wanted to register that. I have the great pleasure of welcoming Caryn to come and speak with us. Thank you for your time.
The Avon lady comes with makeup. I come with books. So even when I just have an overnight and a very small satchel, I end up having a hard time lifting it over my head, but I managed to do it. I'm trying to think of where to put this. Maybe I will put this here and probably today, but it's going to try to help me to keep on time so we can also have an opportunity for you to talk and pose some questions and also share some of the things that that you're doing on your campuses, because I think you are a group of practitioners at different levels and in different kinds of domains on your campuses and in policy as well. But I want to thank Mani for her introduction, but even more importantly for the kind of work she does by organizing this state, creating an infrastructure. We really need the infrastructures. Whether George and I come from higher ed, which are helpful. Campus Compact, of course, is a national office, but there are 35 states. And it makes a difference to have staff people to whom this is what they do. They're there to try and provide venues for deeper learning around civic learning and democratic engagement. And she's been certainly a dedicated and very sophisticated leader in this work for so long, and a very important partner with so many community groups, which allows us to do even more extensive, deeper transformative learning. And I want to thank Mary Evans and her team at Middle State, Tennessee, and anyone else she coerced into doing this. I think there was a lot for making this conference happen, and if you want to know what democracy looks like, plan a conference. It has many faces. And I also want to compliment the state of Tennessee's Board of Regents for saying this matters, that this is important. And I think when the Board of Regents gives space, gives blessing, rewards leaders, gives recognition to those of you doing the work and creates these kind of spaces, it's really important. And you will hear a little bit more from John Reif about how that began to affect and raise the level everywhere in the public institutions in Massachusetts. Because I know so many of you, having been at Pellissippi State in February, you know, are knee-deep in doing democracy, the kind of title that I'm playing with. And of course, since I am also an NEH recipient, it was wonderful to see the National Endowment. I have my PhDs in English, so it's wonderful to remind people that the humanities are really absolutely fundamental to our ability to do democracy. If we can't imagine what someone is feeling, if we don't listen to stories about what their lives have been, if we don't know the histories, if we don't ask the big ethical, philosophical questions, then we will become kind of instruments that bang gavels and organize databases that determine whether we can vote or not. You know, or that is an important thing. But democracy is really ultimately about relationships, though those relationships are sometimes systemic, but they're also at some level very, very personal. I thought that I would try to pick up Mani's, I think, very important localizing of one of the issues for you sitting in Tennessee. What does it mean to be in a state where there are 40 hate groups? We were in the middle of an institute in early July, and I mean, this has been just a sort of period of enormous anguish, and the last day of our institute was the day that the truck in Nice went berserk and killed so many families celebrating their 4th of July. But we just imagine for a minute that you're the one who answers the phone call. And the phone call is from a group of families who have been affected by the death in Baton Rouge of one more black man at the hands of police. Or you are the governor of Minnesota who is trying to come to terms with what it means that another man has been murdered in your state. Or you get a call from the police chief in Dallas and trying to say, I don't understand what's going on. This was an interracial, intergenerational, lots of neighborhoods coming together to join to say we want a different kind of community. We want social cohesion, and ends up with targeted policemen. And Obama calls you. He's still got time in office, and I think the Republicans will permit him to make a phone call or two in his last months, maybe not appoint a Supreme Court justice. But so he has called you, and he said, you know, I've only got 6 months left, so I want to know what you're doing on your campus. What are you contributing to this moment of crisis and pain and anguish, so that the students that you are teaching, the faculty that are working there, the employees, whether they're in student affairs, academic affairs, career counselors, facilities people, living in communities that are under this kind of duress, what do you say? If he said, I'll give you money, what would you do? I mean, these are real things. I mean, these don't happen just on TV screens. And the students, even when they're not in our communities, there's some way in which they go deep into other kinds of pain, fears, and anxieties. And at the same time that we have this kind of urgency out of anguish, I think in this country, I feel a little bit Pollyannish. Those of you who might have watched the conventions last night, everybody was saying what a wonderful moment it is and how hopeful people are about the future of the country. And I actually have this same kind of feeling. I do feel like, I understand the limits of higher education, but I think higher education is one of the most exciting, dynamic places in our society. That it is, we talk about it as staid, but if I compare what students get today, my daughters have now been out for 15 years, but one of them became a faculty member, so I would hear what the students were doing. And when I see what faculty and staff, what kind of partnerships universities have and colleges and two-year colleges have with everyone in their communities, I think I didn't have any of that. And I thought I got a great education. And I realize now all the things I didn't have at my fingertips. So I think this is a really exciting moment, and this year, for all of its anguish, has been a year of enormous political activism by students. I mean, they're asking hard questions of those of us in higher ed. They're asking questions about how we do our business, why we name buildings like we do, what we're doing in terms of creating citizens who see the multitude of people beyond their skin color or beyond which bathroom door they use, or are asking us tough questions about where the materials, where the sweatshirts are in our school, college stores, where are they made, under what conditions. So they're asking these I went to my Duke reunion, and they'd taken over the administration building the week before, and they had tents outside the tents we were going into, and they handed us little things explaining what their issue was. I mean, they were very active, and though if I were a president, I would think that would make my days long, it's actually a very good thing for democracy. And I think with some of the people new to democracy, I was struck, there was one story about some of the Bernie or Bust members walking out of the convention saying, this is what democracy looks like. The reality is, yeah, it looks like that, and it looks like what the people are doing inside the building too. It looks like a whole lot of different things, and part of what we have to figure out, and Obama talked a little bit about that last night. I mean, about it's tough work when you get down in the arena and try to do the work, as opposed to talk about the work. But I think it's an exciting moment to be in higher education. There is so much out there now that's exciting for you to pick up, and I think I'm sort of going to get a sense of who's in the audience now. How many of you are are teaching some sort of, would say, I'm actually doing something with civic learning or service learning or civic engagement, and I'm kind of been doing it for 1 to 3 years. How many of you are sort of in that? And how many of you have never, ever done it? And you kind of think, I'm for it, I support those who do, but it's not, in my bailiwick, or I don't know how. And how many of you would say I'm a veteran? I've been at this for a long time. This is how I define part of my role. So there's a little bit of everyone here. And I would say to those of you who are the first, early novices in this kind of work, one of the wonderful things is it's been around, as George told you, for quite some time. Some of us count it beginning, some of us count it with the GI Bill, or the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, or the end of racial apartheid in our country, or the real demographic shifts that came into place, by the 80s. Women were the majority of students by, I think it was probably by 82. Community colleges now educate 40% of every student who starts at a community college. This is a different world than my dad grew up in which, when he was born, 2% went to college. By 1945, it had gone all the way, it doubled. It went all the way up to 5 or 6%. I was shocked that in the 40s we didn't actually educate more people. And by the time my father's granddaughters went to college, 77% of people who graduated from high school went on to some sort of college. So the 20th century has been enormously transformative. It's been one of the most democratizing centuries for higher education, and therefore for all the people that went to college, because it just opens up doors, opens up minds, opens up possibilities, opens up new jobs, opens up new visions of what you can do, makes the country richer, makes us more creative. So this is a very exciting moment for us. So I have brought lots of stuff here that's just what AAC&U does. And I do not plan to take it home. So I just invite you during the break to come down and just take whatever you want. All of it is online. You can also buy copies, etc. Something like Diversity and Democracy, which is one of our quarterlies, is written by people like you who are on campuses. And it is saying this is how we just have one working collectively across differences. It's one of the latest ones out, another one on public engagement and scholarship. What does that look like? Another one on how do you transform general education. These are your peers at colleges and universities like yours. AAC&U has 1,500 members, 2-year, 4-year, urban, rural, large, small. Every sector is there, because we're not really representing sectors, but representing learning and the quality of what students ought to learn. And for the more seasoned veterans, you know that the world is changing out there. That we might have begun with service learning, but now there are so many exciting pedagogies. George just began to talk about one, the way in which digital teaching and learning can actually have a civic component and engagement. And we're trying to figure out how to do that even better. And we better figure out how to do it, since an awful lot of people are getting their education that way. And for those of you who think, well, I don't know whether I can do it, I want to assure you that the list of what you need in order to function, to be responsible, informed, and know how to participate in a diverse U.S. democracy across all these kinds of differences of race and class and religion and economics and sexual identity, you name it, and do all of that in the middle of a global context that is fluid all the time. There's got to be something you do that is probably not named as civic, but in fact is going to be one of those little pieces that an undergraduate student is going to need to do democracy really responsibly. I chose as my title, Doing Democracy Through Diversity, and that's in part because I'm so tied. I mean, I cannot think of one without the other. I think we have had one without the other. I think I had an education that was very good about a very small part of the world. And part of what Crucible Moment was essentially arguing was that we need a more comprehensive understanding of what we mean by the history of democracy. That it wasn't just the history of the founding fathers. It was really the history. If Michelle Obama mentioned that. I didn't learn this probably till I was 50 and living in Washington. That the White House and the Capitol were built by slaves. We don't tell that. We have a river named Potomac, and it's only that we begin to say, well, what does that represent? Who was there? The sort of stories that I think part of what diversity and the scholarship of diversity that someone like Ron Takaki that really told the history of America through so many different lenses of the stories of people who came to this country, it just enriches it beyond what it could possibly be. And when we put these two together, the diversity and the democracy, it ends up, by all evidence that we have so far, a win-win for everyone anyway. This is not like an add-on, though I think in the beginning it was seen as that. There's the good stuff, and then there's diversity, which you kind of accommodate, which might now just mean you have some people of color at your school. Whereas, what we really, mean by this is something far about the deepest understandings of knowledge. So what if we really, one of the recommendations in Crucible about history is that we learn we do learn about the founding documents, but we learn about the debates at the time. The letter from Abigail saying, remember the ladies, John, because if you do not, we will foment a revolution. And we did. And it's probably taken till, however, whatever, what are we up to now? 250 years or so before a woman gets to be even nominated for a presidency. But that the beginning was an evolution, and I think that's one thing about democracy is that it's always evolving. But the work of Civic and the research about what happens to students when they're involved in civic learning, what happens to us faculty, staff, how students organize their work, the kind of environments we have on campuses, it's a win-win for everybody. The learning is accelerated. The pedagogy is more innovative and student-centered. The retention of students is higher. The graduation rates are better. These are not, and people weren't anticipating that. They just noticed suddenly it made a big difference. It also just sort of, it helps students get jobs because they're learning something, learning how to apply what they know in real-world problem solving, as George was talking about. There's a lot of that deeply embedded in a lot of what's happening in colleges and universities around the country. Well, let me just, this is the sort of world, the word cloud that suggests some of the density of what we mean. I'm going to play just a little bit with some of the language of doing and of democracy and of diversity. It's a lot of things, and it's in a different context. Some of the things in Crucible talks about that we need to know not just our own history, but the history of other struggles for democracy. So if you end up, for instance, comparing the United States Constitution with the new Constitution in South Africa, they're quite different. And there are very interesting ways in which they have incorporated a recognition of the multiplicity of the people in South Africa that we do not yet have in our very own document. So sometimes these emerging democracies are experimental and can actually teach us things as well, even though we're older. One of the things that does is the context for the doing of it is how interconnected we all are. It's very difficult to not be interconnected in this highly webbed world, not just by however it is we get our Wi-Fi or don't get it. But it is also complicated by these structures of tangled webs of power and inequality. This is actually about debt, but some of them are thick and some of them are thin, that when you all come together, you're not all equal and happy and sitting around the table. We learn that in international politics when the IMF decides a new economic policy that doesn't, and then it is imposed on the rest of the world who had no say over it. So we are in this complicated, connected world that doesn't have equal voice, and that's part of what we have to think about. The method of doing democracy, however, I think when we are connected to each, so connected, is that the most important thing about what you can do is what you can do not alone, but with others. And that's where the diversity matters, the sort of who are those others? How do you tell them who you are? How important is that? And so I'm going to, just sort of focus in my comments on the 3 Ds, not the ABC, but the 3 Ds of where a lot of you are sitting right now, where higher ed is doing so much exciting work. That is the doing, the democracy, and the diversity. Ben Barber, one of the very important scholars who's written a lot about democracy, both here and outside our nation, reminds us in a way that I think in a survey we had done with students, undergraduate students in our survey, our focus group, really just thought you were born knowing all this, and that you didn't come to college to learn how to be good citizens. You learned it somewhere else. And Barber is really saying, this just doesn't, it's just not in your genes. We really have to learn it. And we can't just learn it in books, we have to do it. And there is a kind of art of citizenship. Last night you heard Obama talking about how hard it was, and of course this has not been one of our more splendid moments in a sort of representative government where you're supposed to cross the aisle and listen and compromise. There is not compromising going on much at all. And he says, democracy works. This is a little bit like Ben Franklin, but you gotta want it. You gotta want it. And George had said this is not a spectator sport, it's a contact sport. And Obama said you just have to get in the arena. And what we mean by getting in the arena and who are seen as citizens becomes another one of the complicating things about the doing of democracy. And I'll share with you, it's a very moving passage by Parker Palmer. Some of you might know his wonderful work. This one's called The Healing the Heart of Democracy. And it's in a chapter called Confessions of an Accidental Citizen. He writes, as a white male American who has always been well off, the kind of person for whom this nation has always worked well, the gift of full citizenship, unquestioned and unchallenged, came to me as an accident of birth. Today I realize the magnitude of that gift. But for years, I was an unconscious and ungrateful recipient because attaining citizenship required no effort from me. And in the work that we're doing in our NEH Citizenship Under Siege, we're kind of exploring different faces of citizenships for different groups at different times in history. It is fluctuating. So we are, one Lone Star is looking at economic inequality and its effect on the practice of everyday democracy. County College of Morris in New Jersey is looking at gender and race and how that is the recognition of those two categories has shifted over time, and the painstaking, slow evolution to full suffrage for all women is studied and looked at through history. This is a humanities grant, this is particularly interesting for this conference, the Kingsborough, is looking, that is in Brooklyn, one of the more diverse sections of the whole country, and they are looking at religious pluralism and citizenship. So there they are in the always at the epicenter of immigration on this side of the continent anyway, and certainly the epicenter of 9/11, which got inflected with religion, though it is so it is a complicated place where Holocaust survivors and pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian and Jewish communities and Christian and Catholic and any other people you can think live in the same neighborhood or side by side or going to the same community college. So really, really interesting work to try and piece that out so that we don't think, oh, it's really easy, I'll just look at the manual and I'll know all I need to know about citizenship, which we used to sort of have that minimalist. That's just not going to do anymore. I wanted to give you just another, just a little bit of a background to the Truman, and I had a Truman quote which I won't spend any time on. One of the reasons there was such concern and why Truman, after the war, brought together university presidents to create a commission was that Europe and democracies look like this on the continent. You know, we were bombed in Hawaii, but we were not bombed here. And so, and Germany at the time was the best educated set of citizens in the world. So what went wrong? And what do we want? You know, it wasn't just the, reconstruction of Europe and of the economies. It was really, what does it take to do that? So, you know, that really was the sort of driving force, because they felt as if democracy was really at risk, and fascism won almost everywhere. So, they talked about international cooperation. They talked about explicitly for the full realization of democracy in every phase of living. This is what higher education is supposed to do, and for the application to solve real problems. Like, you couldn't just sit here and say, the war's over, I'm going home. So one of the things that we've sort of moved through the doing of democracy and democracy itself, and with diversity, I wanted to talk a little bit about diversity in terms of it being a high-impact practice. It's one of the things that improves the other high-impact practices. Service learning, when for students, it puts them in relationship to people that are not familiar to them. That it really changes things or produces more outcomes. A first-year seminar, which is a high-impact practice itself, when it is includes diversity subjects, pick it could be in any of George's the sort of range of outcomes for students is much more comprehensive than if the diversity is not there. But diversity itself in the curriculum gets all of these things you see behind me that are all deeply connected to the kind of skills you need for a diverse democracy. It's interesting, when we did our big, we did at AAC&U from 92 to 2002, we did a kind of massive thing, NEH and largely the Ford Foundation, but ultimately Hewlett and Kellogg and a lot of other people that were doing diversity work in that period with colleges and universities, worked, I guess we ended up with 263 institutions and big conferences, and ACE was still doing its Educating All of One Nation conferences. We were struggling to talk about diversity in new ways, and we came up with a phrase that no one ever picked up. It was called relational pluralism. We talked about a pluralist democracy. When we started using it, I kind of thought, well, this feels old and fusty. And then we realized, as the research also said, diversity is just this room is diverse, so what? What makes a difference is when we engage with each other across those differences. the analogy that Pat Caryn at Michigan in the court case, the Supreme Court case around affirmative action and arguing for diversity as a learning was that it's like books in the library. You can have millions, but if students are never reading them, they will have little effect. And when I was in South Africa as part of a Ford Foundation program looking with educators from South Africa, India, and the U.S. on the role of higher education in diverse democracies, the oldest, the youngest, and the biggest at that time, I remember the student affairs person at an institution in Durban that had previously been Indian. They had 4 different kinds of institutions by color. Now, after the end of apartheid, they for years, every time we met with them, there was a new white paper to reimagine. Talk about having to start from scratch, George, to reimagine what in the world they could do. He said, "Well, we now have Zulus and Indians, at the same institution, but they walk past each other in the hallways." And I looked at him thinking, "Well, this is." Yeah, this is what we struggle with on our campuses too. What is it that we can do to engage students with each other, learning from each other, to be curious about each other, and then to be curious about the larger world beyond themselves? These are just some other outcomes that you can see, the twinning of diversity and democracy pieces. The democratic sensibilities, wanting to make a difference in society, feeling like you don't just want to make a good life for yourself, but you're back to that preamble to promote the general welfare, to establish justice, not just for yourself, but for everyone. And intergroup dialogue, which is also another it's not actually named in CU's high impact practice, but we name it in Crucible because the kind of different kinds of dialogue, this one is a particular course-based, credit-bearing that began at Michigan and normally picks just 2 different big markers that it begins to explore, race and gender or race and religion. And students are in intense, facilitated conversations, doing lots of reading, telling lots of stories, and it has profound effects on them. And I think one of the pieces, they did a national study of all the colleges that were doing intergroups, and they think had 57 different things. So they're put together kind of national data, and we have that in one of our issues of liberal education. The thing that I remember being so struck by was how long it lasted. Because sometimes the effect is like 3 months, maybe a year, and then it wears off. But this one stays with people. And then to think about the kinds of pedagogies we know and we can use and you can tap. You may say, oh, well, I think of that as my diversity stuff. But it's your civic stuff. It's your democracy stuff. Or I think I'm doing civic but not diversity. But in fact, they're really like twin echo chambers for each other. Distinctive, but commentaries on each other. And then this last one is a chart from Silvia Hurtado, in which she's looking at the effects, the different effects of service learning materials or readings about, she's looking specifically at race and ethnicity, and in that case, and opportunities for dialogue across differences. What's important about this is the effect of all of them, and the fact that the one that is the highest over time is the sustained conversations with someone else. There is a quote that I probably won't get to do the whole thing about, from Terry Tempest Williams, who is one of my favorite writers. But she essentially says, the heart is the first home of democracy. The heart, what you're feeling. So the way in which, that's a piece of this is where the student affairs piece is so critical to do add-ons to those of us who are a little more cerebral in faculty areas. But how to bring in the empathy, how to bring in the feeling, how to open the heart as well as the mind, and to use the hands in some kind of engagement work that brings all three together. But the home is the first heart of democracy. So those relationships are critical. You've seen Crucible Moment. You can get your free copy here. The only thing I would say about it probably, to add to what George said, was that when we finished it, AAC&U published it, but it was really the people's document. 150 people gave all sorts of recommendations for it. They came from campuses, scholars, practitioners, presidents, student affairs, outside civic organizations, disciplinary groups, the federal government. We had a lot of people, and its recommendations in the middle, touch on all of those: what the federal government should do, what philanthropists should do, what K through 12 system should do. It was like it isn't just us, and we have to see ourselves as part of a mosaic. But there are 13 groups that have continued that I convene. That were among those who had done it, and we said, how do we help give this legs? So there's lots of groups beyond the ones that George named, so you need to keep those in mind, depending on which kind you do. Because there's all, in addition to Campus Compact and NASPA and AAC&U, bringing theory to practice probably has put more money into civic work in the last 10 years than anyone else. Imagining America is a splendid group for those of you who are in humanities, arts, and design. The Anchor Institutions Task Force for people doing deep community development and engagement is really got good material as well. The Kettering Interfaith Youth Corps is that it is there it puts together that you will end up, its theory is that the more you engage with people across different faiths, doing things together, which is kind of a standard thing for any kind of diversity, the more you will learn about each other and come to respect and know each other. So they are doing spectacular work, and for student-led stuff, like the Bonner Foundation is smaller and Interfaith is very open, but it's really a great place to send some of your students to some of their training sessions. One of the big findings we had was there was lots going on. It was so impressive. It was everywhere, but it was also random. There was no signing. One hand didn't know what the other hand was doing. We hadn't really figured out how to give students. Do you remember when we started doing journals? Maybe you didn't do them. Women's Studies started doing journals really early, and then everybody did a journal, and students hated doing journals because everybody assigned journals. Rather than say, okay, we won't all do them. We'll sort of. And if it's a journal in one, it'll be some other kind of writing project after that. So to vary it, this is what we are just beginning to sort now to get some pathways. And let me just and this is to raise the bar. This is just one measure of what students tell us. 1/3 of students say being in college helped them enlarge their civic awareness, enhance their skills to do the civic work, and promote the commitment to do it, or somehow foster the commitment to do the work. 1 out of 3. So what we've got is really good for 1 out of 3. So I think one of the big messages out of Crucible, those of us who were trying to say, where are we now? How do we make it better? Was that we have to make it pervasive. So rather than being optional for some students, just make it expected of everyone. We didn't say some of you can learn to write. We didn't settle for that. We may not have cured all the things that we wanted to do with writing, but we just said everybody's got to have a hand in this, and that's where we are with this. This is just an attempt, to say, well, what would that look like? And though it's Crucible Moment and AAC&U in particular spends a lot of time, we care deeply about teaching and learning, this is really an institution-wide thing. Doesn't just have to do with teaching. The civic ethos everywhere. You walk on a campus and you know that it's a campus that cares. And how do you know that? That's going to come out in a lot of different ways, from a lot of different sources of people. And civic literacy and civic inquiry and civic action, which is going to be in multiple kinds of ways. And I think some of the pedagogies that have come out of that one, these are the first big, and I'm really focusing on advancing this bigger framework for civic learning and expanding the number of partnerships and how you do that. So this is really saying that it's not static, it's full of debate, it's very messy. You're not going to agree. I loved it when Obama said, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats should be disagreeing. That's what makes democracy have oxygen. But you got to then voice it and then, you know, make the compromises. You got to say settle for something so you move forward together. That's what we're lacking, I think, in our big white dome, which is where I live, or near that. But to really understand, democracy was never certain. It was always contested. It still is contested. It's got competing principles, you know, all the time. So you're always engaged in what it means and what it means to live together. And it's not just my rights. It's our world and its rights. And it's not just what's happening now. It's why does it matter? You know, there's one wonderful, you know, president, you might have read about him, the president, John DeGioia of Georgetown. They had discovered that Georgetown was about to go under financially. And so, and I'm going to forget the date, I'm going to make up one, 1802. They decided that the Jesuits on the plantation in Maryland would sell some of their slaves, because the Jesuits had slaves, and that gave them the money that put the university into solvency. And DeGioia isn't saying, boy, that was a terrible thing to do. I'm glad I wasn't around. I didn't have anything to do with that. They're actually trying to trace who those people were that were sold. Where did they go? Who are their progeny? How do we write about that? How do we get a memory project? How do we make that part of how we understand what we have here and at whose expense? What does this mean in terms of the ethical responsibilities of this university to those descendants? And he is having these conversations around the country with people of a level and an intimacy. I have no idea what will finally come of it, but it is a kind of engagement with diversity in which, as Faulkner would say, the past is always present. And the fact that Black Lives Matter, you can have some people say all lives matter very quickly and easily. But why is it that African Americans are saying Black Lives Matter? Because so many times and so much of our history is proof that it didn't matter. And so it's not just these murders. It's this history that is just part of what it means to be an American. And if we don't kind of come to terms with that and help our students come to terms with that and ask people to talk about it, and this comes around religion. I remember moving to Philadelphia, and I'm Protestant, and I taught at a Catholic school, and my students were so excited that Rizzo was going to be mayor, who at that point I was not a fan of Frank Rizzo, who was a policeman. And a kind of, you know, very tough policeman who, you know, didn't brook any dissent from anyone, you know, particularly political protesters. And he became mayor, and they were just so excited because Philadelphia had never had a Catholic mayor, and it's a very Catholic city. And I'm kind of thinking, oh, I guess I might be proud too. It had never occurred to me that you'd been shut out. I mean, I didn't even see it, you know, growing up in Philadelphia. Didn't see it. So often we don't see the things we aren't, just like Parker Palmer said. These are some of the pedagogies that are being done, and the ones on the right-hand side, and this is to open up your minds. Those of you who are beginning, often we go straight to service learning, which is the version in global. I also ran the office on global learning at AAC&U before I stepped down to do the civic work exclusively. And if you'd say, what are you doing for global? We would begin to get how many students were sent abroad. which is really good. And service learning is now the best pedagogy, high impact, better than undergraduate research, anything else, in terms of how many impacts it has on people, because I think it's a blended, hybrid set of high impact practices. But it isn't the only form, and not everybody can do it, and not everybody can do it well, and not every subject lends itself well to that. So you want to look at the multiple kinds of ways. And some communities say, if you send one more student over here to tutor somebody or fix a house, that's not what I need. So what is it that community needs, and who's asking them? And so you begin to have a whole series of and range. The dialogue I commented, and lots of people are doing sustained dialogue as a smaller program in student affairs, often student run. There's deliberation across difference, which is, the Kettering Foundation supports a lot of deliberative dialogue. Some of those are in class, some of those are out of class. Campus community partnerships, this is the area where we are moving. And see, as someone said, how did they say it? From paternalism to partnership. And this was someone this was in one of our last issues of Diversity and Democracy, and she talks about how when she looked at her old syllabus for service learning, it was filled with needs and outreach language. And now it's been replaced by partnership. But she then goes in to talk about how hard that is, and that one of the things she's learned that makes a difference is, she named two things. One, deep listening, particularly to the partner that isn't normally the dominant one. And the second one was stubborn commitment. That is, you don't walk away. You stay with that, we stay with that partner. You invent with that partner other ways to do this. You layer kinds of students, not just Caryn wants to do this course on oral history and she'll do it, but she's going to go on sabbatical next year, and so that's going to die. So what is it that would sustain these? And there's wonderful, wonderful examples. Then there's all these new stuff. You can organize internships that are civic oriented in their exploration and what the students are learning. Social entrepreneurship and innovation is this burgeoning area on many college campuses. Lafayette, where my daughter used to teach, is doing its civic work under the, through the wedge of economic development, saying if you don't have economic independence and sustained economic development, democracy can't flourish. And there's a wonderful story in the Imagining America issue on publicly engaged scholarship of the story of over 7 years of the work he did with students in engineering and other disciplines with a little village in Honduras, who began by wanting to find a way to get a system that would distribute the water more evenly to the village, because it was only getting to people near the river. And then once they did that, they didn't have the money to sustain the new structure, so they had to figure out how to do an economic development based on a water economy now. And then once they did that, they had to work with them to get land rights and to help them with marketing and communication of their goods. I mean, so it would evolve over time. But it was a 7-year relationship. Okay, I'm just going to zip just to say one of the things that you see people doing is making civic literacy an expectation through gen ed. From beginning, and if you have a 2-year, it's you don't just stop with one. Some people are having requirements in that field. You can integrate civic inquiry into a central field of study, and these are ones that show the required courses in gen ed, a Research One university, and a community college. Queensborough, I think, also has done this in New York. This is an example of Worcester Polytechnic that starts with a first-year seminar. Sounds a lot like George's. I mean, they invented this several years ago, in which the students they can choose to be in one of these wonderful, exciting first-year seminars. And do project-based team-taught courses that lead up to their third year, which is usually abroad in groups with others, that then leads to the special studies in their major. So this moves away from the randomness of what we found 5 years ago in Crucible to really trying to plot and make the pathways clearer to students. And it was, they had year 3 and 4 put together before they figured out that they weren't giving their students any practice on this project-based work until their junior year. So that's been wonderful. This is the move of civic prompts, trying to look at the major with civic lens, trying to say to departments, it's really saying, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You tell me what you're doing. What are the civic issues in chemistry? What are the lines of inquiry? What are the pedagogies that make sense for you? You might not even use the word civic. What about accounting? And this is Cal State, Monterey Bay. This is an IT second level course in the major. So they're doing service work, but they're asking this other question while they're there. As I'm working with this, what am I learning about my responsibilities as an IT professional? And they do it in business as well, trying to look at the triple bottom line. So not just thinking about the profit. So I wanted to put this slide up. This is Emily Janke, who was an AAC&U winner of the Emerging Scholar. She's at UNC Greensboro. And what she is doing and builds on another scholar's work is talking about the thickening the relationships. If you think back to the slide with all the wires, how do you get them so they're not thin and vulnerable, but they're deep relationships that are moving from doing work on the community to the community for the community till you're doing it with the community. One thing I didn't say, and I should end with this, and I'll give one example of a community that did, is what it means to be here and not on a campus. And I want to thank you, Mary, for taking us to the Islamic Center, out into the community rather than on our space. And that's what campuses are doing in it. And I will just end with this picture, because this picture is an example of what a difference it can make when you decide creatively in multiple ways what you can do with a community that you have deep listening and a stubborn commitment to. This is the Paola elementary school right next to a housing project that Kapiolani, in particular, I know much more about their work, but I think the University of Hawaii has been involved. This was the lowest performing school. Most of the people from the housing project go there. So we're doing all kinds of work with the housing project, making it more beautiful, putting computer sciences in there, creating a science lab, getting kids into college, and working in this school district. It is now one of the most high performing. So what you've done, one of these kids may be doing the speech at a presidential convention 15 years from now, because colleges said it matters to us that some kids are doing poorly, and we think we have resources to make a difference. And in fact, they did, they do, and you could too. Thank you very much. Sorry to run over.